for many Indians, it's almost the first language. And it's certainly one of a range of languages they use. Some of the best English on the planet is spoken in India. If you listen to All India Radio, their accents are more BBC than the BBC, if you can say that. And of course there's a very strong literary tradition in English in India. So although English maybe is not the native tongue of India, it's certainly a very important language in the country. But it's not the only language, and this is my point. Other flags there. China. China has more English teachers than any other country in the world. This runs into millions of English teachers. They've got one English language teaching magazine that has a print run of 11 million every month. 11 million, that's an enormous number of magazines addressed to English teachers. And that's really where a lot of the money, a lot of the action in English language teaching is these days. It was mentioned yesterday, Chinese is one of the most dominant languages on the planet, but the Chinese government is investing a lot of money in teaching English to its people. Okay, let's move on here. So, we've got these two kinds of country. Country where English is seen as the native language, countries where English is used to a different extent. It could be very important or slightly important. Almost everywhere you go in the world, you can find somebody who knows some English, even if it's "Good morning, mister," which is what I get quite a lot. So, I'm looking at introducing you to this dichotomy, one thing against another. A country where English is native speaking, a country where it's not. Those are the basic divisions at the moment. But what does it mean for us as teachers, as educators? Well, we also have two ways of looking at English as an educator, as a teacher. One way is English as what you might call an academic subject involving the study of the native speaker country. I think this is the traditional way of looking at it in many countries I've been to. English is derived from the language, the culture of the native speaking country. In many schools I go to, in many different countries, there is still a focus on the culture of, say, the United Kingdom, as well as the language, or the culture of the United States, as well as the language. This, to me, is sort of English as a subject, involving cultural things as well. And it tends to go on into specialization in the language and in the linguistics of English. Also, studies of the arts. In English language departments around the world, there's a lot of research done into literature, which is still based on classic literature, on Shakespeare, on Dickens, and the rest. I'm not saying this is right or wrong, I'm just trying to describe this. I just want to talk and speak in English, but it could involve all four skills and generally does. So this is a more modern focus on what we're teaching. We're teaching the skills of communication in English, not so much the culture of native-speaking countries. This also brings us to intercultural competency, not study of the culture of the native-speaking country, but looking at how to deal with people of many different cultures. What misunderstandings arise because of cultural differences? And how can we see this affecting language teaching and language learning? Okay, language. International disciplines require different skills. If we have a scientist wanting to learn English for his own professional work, does he or she need to learn something different from an airline pilot who needs it for his or her job? That's the interesting part for me. Okay, let's move on. What we as teachers these days are increasingly understanding, and this came up yesterday in talks that we heard, is that we are teaching students, as I say here, to live in a world we have not known and will not know. Our students will go on to live longer than we do, we hope, and they will be exposed to a world we will never know. We don't know what's going to happen to them in the future, later in life. We cannot predict. In the past, it was a bit easier to predict, I think, but we have seen change in technology especially, which is so rapid in the last 10, 15, 20 years, that we cannot really predict what's going to happen in the next 20 to 50 years. Certainly we can't. But we have to teach students to be prepared for that. And we, in particular, are teaching language. What does it mean for language teachers to be in that situation? Well, it's well known that the description of English in the world has been put into graphic form like this since the 1950s. And you've probably seen this before, where in the sort of central circle we have the native speakers, the UK, I put UK in front of the USA, I hope you don't mind. UK, USA, Australia's there, all right, that's no problem. Canada I've got quite close links with. I've not put Scotland in, but you can understand it in the UK. And then you move on to countries like South Africa and India, where English has some official dominance. I put countries like Sweden and Denmark. If you go to Sweden, as many of you may have done, or to Denmark, the language used there is... Who said French? I suppose you could. No, but almost everyone you speak to in Sweden, say, or Denmark, can speak English. I remember a friend going into a restaurant once and asking the waiter, "Do you speak English?" in Denmark. The waiter looked at him as if he was stupid. "Of course I speak English." And that was the reaction there. Of course, not many people speak Danish, except Danes. Not many people speak Swedish, except Swedes. So they have quite an incentive to learn English, to speak to other people. But this does not mean that Danish is getting weaker. It doesn't mean that Swedish is getting weaker. It just means they have an extra language that they can use. Okay, from there we go on to put there China and Russia, where English has been more of a foreign language. Few people speak it, and then usually just for going abroad or something like that. We'll look at that more closely soon. Okay. The statistics are quite familiar to many people. We've seen English as an official language in about 80 countries, some official status. Even in the Emirates where I was, it's not officially official, but it's called the language of business of the country. So it has some status. So where English has some status, then that's what we have. 80 countries, estimated 2 billion speakers or more. Never believe the numbers you see here, because nobody really knows, they're just guessing. But that's an indication it's very, very big. If I see someone say 2 billion, I know they don't really mean 2 billion, They mean very, very big, but it's a way of saying it. English is the first language for almost 400 million people, and it's the second language for another 400 million. And the rest, who use bits and pieces of English, there are large numbers of them as well. As I say, almost everywhere in the world you go, you can find some use of English. That means that English speakers in the world population comprise just about a quarter of the human population of the Earth uses English to some significant extent. All right, and as we know, if you go into various professions, it is very useful to have English. It's one of the major publishing languages around the world. So if you're involved in books, then English. Newspapers too. Most countries in the world have an English language newspaper. I've seen one here as well. I saw one yesterday. And that's quite common, where in some places you wouldn't necessarily expect it. Air traffic, excuse me, air traffic control, the language is English. It's quite a specific kind of English, but it's used in air traffic control. Also marine traffic control is the language of international communication there. Business, academic conferences, such as this one, English is widely used. It's the language of science. 100 years, 150 years ago, the language of science was really German. And most of the journals and scientific papers were published in German. Slowly, over the past 100 years, this has changed. And even in Germany, German scientists publish papers in English. Technology, yes. Diplomacy. Again, the language of diplomacy has varied over the ages. French used to be the language of diplomacy and still is to a certain extent, but English has been taking over there. Language of sport. Yes. I have the story from Uzbekistan, the famous Uzbek referee, Ravshan Ahmedov, yes. He was talking about his use of English in international sport. He talks to other referees, to assistant referees in English. He talks to the players in English. The only people he has problems with understanding are English people. Is that right? Yeah. Everyone else he meets internationally, they get on very well in English. But the